You're driving in your car, and you flawlessly execute several turns. You navigate complex intersections, and you make your way through various stops and signals. You change lanes, you weave through traffic, and then you realize you don't remember doing any of it. Musicians, athletes, Olympians, and artists, they refer to this as flow state, a state of mind characterized by complete immersion and effortless concentration in an activity, where time just seems to fade away. As a matter of fact, a majority of the information that we perceive in this world is processed by our non-conscious mind. These are not new concepts. These are things that people have been deliberating over for years, going all the way back to an early example. Miyamoto Musashi was a famous samurai who fought for the kingdom of Japan. Anytime there was a land dispute, a samurai would come together and then they would fight to be able to determine who would end up conquering that land. Miyamoto was not just a samurai, but he was also an artist and an author. Towards the end of Miyamoto's life, he found himself in the mountains, feeling the need to be able to compress all of the knowledge that he's ended up learning over his time, and not just about war and not just about how to fight, but about what it means to think and be alive. He wrote 5 scrolls that were compressed into this book and is translated the Book of 5 Rings. And in the Book of 5 Rings, the final book refers to this concept, and he refers to it as what's called the void. To his own saying, it represents the ultimate state of understanding and mastery, where one transcends physical techniques and achieves a state of pure intuition and enlightenment. It's the space beyond all forms, where true knowledge and insight arise without the need for conscious thought. Miyamoto mastered the ability to put himself into this state. When he would enter into a battle, he would enter into the void, and when he would exit, he would find just the dead around him. Throughout time, philosophers and others have wondered about how we think, what it is to be alive. This has been a concept that's been wrestled with for quite some time. In more recent history, we've found a number of neuroscientists and others who have started to be able to approach this from a scientific avenue. In this era, Benjamin Libet is famous for his work, while at the time there was only treatment available for people who were undergoing neurological conditions was to open the brain up and to subdue the areas that were causing pain by means of actually burning the nerve endings. He felt that this was pretty brutal, and during this time, while the patients were open, decided that he would introduce a means of measuring and doing some experiments. Benjamin's famous for his work known as the readiness potential, and this shook up a lot in the community. In the experiment, the readiness potential, as he puts it, occurs milliseconds before a person becomes consciously aware of their intention to act, suggesting that unconscious processes precede conscious decision-making. What does this look like? In this experiment, Libet had his patients would watch a counter that would be a circle, and would just show time. And they would be told that at any moment of their choosing, they would flick their wrist. And when they do that, they should recognize where the dot is on the pattern so that they can understand when that person had the intention to flick their wrist, and then we can measure when it actually occurred. According to this experiment, in the readiness potential, you can see here that the moment of the time of awareness of the urge to move, as the center there at negative 200 milliseconds, that's the moment in time in which the patients actually decided, I will move my wrist. But brain activity started increasing prior to this. Controversially, Benjamin's work ended up actually leading into questions of whether or not there is free will. Scientists still struggle with this these days. And in a layered approach, we can kind of understand the human brain and the experience like this. Since a lot of what we process from the outside inward has to pass through these layers in order for them to get to our consciousness, there's a lot of activity that's going on under the hood that we don't have control over. You don't have to think about beating your heart, and you don't have to think about, even the finite movements that it takes to move your hands. Those actions seem to just be natural or effortless. But there's a lot that ends up getting filtered through our world. What we think we're actually experiencing is only a subset of the information that we actually perceive, which in some ways is highly beneficial because there's an awful lot of noise in these environments that could drive us just mad. But what happens when these systems fail? Or what happens when they cause physical ailments and pain? What happens when the systems that are mostly outside of our control end up taking a turn that we didn't want them to? And how can we, from a conscious perspective, end up affecting this? Now, I'm normally the type that would stand up here and show you recipes of code examples that you can use to be able to apply towards building cool things. And there was plenty of that during this conference. So much work in the community to be able to show off what we can do. But today I'm here to be able to talk more about what it's like to engineer the mind. But first, as an introduction, my name is Justin Schneck. You can find me in most places at Mobile Overlord, search for me around. This picture right here is actually a marker that kickstarted a lot of my career and desire to be able to get into embedded systems. And what we're seeing is love of motorcycling can combine with the love of computation. And over the years, I've ended up building and amassing projects that brought me joy. I would do it for creativity. I would do it out of necessity. I would do these things to be able to help others build products. And over this time, as my skills in this domain increased, so did my lab and the tools that I had access to. We've built many projects over this time and learned so much about how to be able to create. I'm known for building communities, authoring tools. I've helped many companies ship lots of products. More recently, I founded a company called Peridio, where we enable software teams and hardware companies to integrate with CI/CD pipelines to help ship code down to distributed devices of all types. Earlier this year, we ended up closing our round, and we're partnered up with Galaxy Interactive, a prominent firm that's in the interactive space for funding these kinds of technologies. And so, why this topic? Well, sometimes the work that you do can't actually apply to everything. And several years ago, my wife ended up getting a lot of symptoms. They were heart palpitations, they were shortness of breath. Whenever she would sit up, these things would arise, a lot of racing conditions. And I thought to myself, well, it seems like anxiety. I should try to help you with this. And no matter what I would do, it ended up wasn't successful. Breathe slower. That doesn't work. And to somebody who's experiencing these things, it's very difficult for you to be able to, from that perspective, try to fix these problems. And sometimes you just need to stop and listen and be a caring person. It's one of the biggest lessons that I've learned. Eventually, we did get more close to the root of things. She was diagnosed with dysautonomia, or in this case, POTS. This is a disorder of the autonomic nervous system, which causes symptoms like rapid heart rate, dizziness, fatigue, particularly when standing up. All of these systems that we find so far out of our control, really. So if we look at this what makes us, that little part at the bottom, that's what you think. That's how you perceive this world. That is you. And when you go to sleep, it shuts down, but the rest of it continues to move. And so once again, when things are coming in through the physical and the non-conscious and then the subconscious layers, they're being filtered in ways that we can't control. And furthermore, neurological diagnosis is complex. And we're mostly treating referred symptoms. When we approach these problems, most of the time the issues arise in the case of, well, I'm feeling pain, or I have shortness of breath. And, well, we'll categorize those in a Western way into what is most frequently this disease or this disorder. And then we'll treat that with some sort of therapy or pharmaceuticals that we know clinically works. But the brain is nuanced. We know more about the body than we do about the brain, very similarly to how we know more about our, space than we do about our oceans. It's this vast network of billions of interconnected little biological computers that are talking to each other. And so, well, what do we need to do to be able to treat some of these symptoms? We can't seemingly do it from the inside out. Interestingly, this problem is pretty big. There was a study in Europe that was constructed that ended up finding that 1 in every 2 to 3 Europeans suffer from a neurological disorder, and that the economic impact of this alone is more than heart disease, than cancer, and diabetes combined. Of the short list of things that are covered in here, we can see ones like Alzheimer's, even migraines or Parkinson's, epilepsy, traumatic injuries, and alone, just by covering some of these topics, we can really make a big dent in the world. Just imagine cancer, diabetes, heart disease, things that we thought were just so big. But all of these potentials that have this in this unknown region, we can actually work towards trying to solve. And if we do, the study ends up proving that if we could scale these rehabilitations up to even nominal conditions, we could save $727 billion by 2030. And if we could do it effectively at adequate levels, it's in the trillions. This study was conducted and followed up on in 2024 to be able to readjust some of these numbers, but the magnitude is massive. And the problem really is only going to get worse. Johns Hopkins recently did a study linking COVID-19 long COVID symptoms to POTS, and that it's one of the leading effects that comes out of people who suffer from long COVID. Now that this is an endemic disease, it's things that are probably going to crop up more and more, and it might be added more to that list. Here's a study that was then officially launched that ended up making these ties back. That was also done by Johns Hopkins University. So what do we have to be able to help us in this domain? Well, neurotechnology does exist. There are ways that we can approach this problem that we can hopefully end up using to solve these things. As of today, there are examples in which we've seen companies that come out to do brain-computer interfaces. Examples like Neuralink. But there's a swath of other ones that are out there that are trying to be able to do this work. Brain-computer interfaces are a desire for us to be able to move into a future where our pointing devices, like a trackpad or a mouse, are no longer this physical control, and that we can have a mental control over our computation. It's quite apropos in the idea of artificial intelligence, this intent-driven model where we can just think about the things we want, and that a simulated thought experiment on the back end could also think about responses to these things as well. Brain-computer interfaces are also a fantastic tool that we can use to be able to drive modern prosthetics. A lot of people who have had to have amputations for various reasons end up these days getting a more intelligent means of reintegrating with the world. Lost limbs, hands, anything that's tactile now can have a link to the neurons that we used to be able to control those limbs with. We can infer the intent that we want. And at a fairly high level of accuracy, we can even start to be able to do some more precision movements in detail. And there's an ongoing debate over the means of doing this in an invasive or a non-invasive way. Some implants are quite invasive, and you have to do these things to be able to get higher fidelity. The skull is pretty thick, And with these days, though, I think that there's a lot of advancements that we can see in non-invasive approaches that can help us actually do these things more accurately and create experiences that might be a bit more futuristic or more used to the norm, things that we would be able to repair ourselves with. And in addition to a lot of this prosthetic work and brain-computer interfaces, these are tools that we have access to help integrate ourselves more effectively with computer systems and hardware. There's also a variety of therapies that exist. These would be tools that we can use to try to be able to subdue some of the problems and issues that we think of or that we've seen on the previous list. Anxieties, or even disorders like that. First off is one known as EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. This is actually a technique that has gained widespread recognition for its effectiveness in treating trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. EMDR involves guiding eye movements, or other forms of bilateral stimulation across the body, which help the brain process and integrate distressing memories, which reduces their emotional impact. It's a phenomenon that's wild. There's so much we can do through the optic nerve, it seems, that just alone can actually solve a lot of these problems. Originally this was developed for trauma, but EMDR has actually been applied to a range of other conditions, including anxiety and depression. And by facilitating the brain's natural healing processes, EMDR helps individuals with negative experiences reframe them and promoting emotional resilience and recovery. Another one that's available to us in the same domain is light therapies, syntonics and phototherapy, even something so simple as light boxes. There's so much about our emotional state that can be coerced just by being in the sun. And with light therapies, we have the ability to experiment with different wavelengths of light. In these cases, these heavily influence the optic nerve and enhance brain functions. Syntonics, for example, is a form of visual stimulation that's shown promise in treating ADHD and even dyslexia. And we can carefully target these visual pathways. This therapy actually aims to balance the autonomic nervous system and improve focus, enhance reading skills and learning capabilities. So what we've seen in this is that even for people with ADHD, syntonics can help regulate attention and reduce hyperactivity by influencing the neural circuits in these behaviors. In dyslexia, it also has been found to improve the visual processing fields and ease the difficulties associated with a majority of learning disorders. Finally, a more barbaric approach, back to our examples of Lebet's research, is neurostimulation. There are situations where we want to be able to influence or write back to the machine. And neurostimulation, this refers to a therapeutic activation of nervous system, and it uses electrical or sometimes even magnetic or other forms of energy. It involves the use of a device that delivers a targeted stimulation to an area of the brain, the spinal cord, or even just other areas of the nervous system. And this is widely used in cases where neurological and psychiatric conditions like chronic pain or epilepsy, even depression, Parkinson's disease, and others, Neurostimulation will end up modulating the activity, will introduce some sort of feedback mechanisms that'll help coerce the patient into an area of reducing the sort of referred symptoms. But there's been an evolution to what we have available to us. New technologies and new studies found some pretty amazing things. One group of which, this is Adam Gazelli. He's the founder and executive director of Neuroscape. It's a research group out of UCSF. And Adam's group found something quite profound a while ago. They built a game called NeuroRacer that would end up training on a group of elderly patients who would be most likely in a cognitive decline. Towards the end of our lives, mostly, there's a cognitive decline that you're not as sharp as you used to be. And the game itself had sort of a biofeedback mechanism to it, where it would respond to the way that you're playing the game, and it would either ease the game mechanics so that they'd be more in tune with where you're at, or it would make them more difficult to be able to challenge you. It would keep it right at that sweet spot. And they would be working towards focusing on the game itself. And while focusing on the game, what they ended up finding in their study was that this group in older adults, it ended up enhancing their cognitive capabilities. They were able to actually create a game that could rewrite your brain. This was big. Big enough to get onto the cover of Nature, which, if you're not familiar with scientific articles, this is kind of like being a musician on the cover of Rolling Stone. After this was published, there was a follow-up to the research. They brought back the same group, and even more astonishingly, the people that were involved in the group, having not played the game anymore after that initial research, ended up coming back 6 years later and still had lasting effects. Now, I don't know about you, but if I eat wrong for 2 weeks, that's just off the rails. Seeing that this can actually change you physically, chemically, and mentally with just playing this kind of biofeedback mechanism and having such lasting effects is astonishing. Adam talks about an interesting point in this domain. You think, well, you're having an experience, and the experience is causing you to focus. Most of our lives are built on experience. All those layers of that sort of onion of ourselves that's outside of our cognitive control, those are built and codified off of practice and study. Those musicians that we've seen play that music because they've ingrained it into their bodies. As being a drummer myself, I know that the moment I think about what I'm doing, I mess up. Because the cognitive loop is slow. It's energy intensive, and it takes a long time to sort of spin up and process. Adam discovers and talks about a link, and you can think of it in this profound way that experience is really what ends up codifying and driving a lot of those behavioral layers. And PTSD, for example, is an experience so horrific that it has lasting chemical and physical and mental effects on you. And if we can counter that with positive experience, ones like this, then we can build and design technologies that in non-invasive ways can actually go and help people. Another fun one that might be more relatable to everybody is Super Mario Odyssey. There was a study that was done on this game where they took a group into 3 different cohorts. One group played Super Mario Odyssey, and these were people who were experiencing symptoms of anxiety and depression. They also put another group together of this CogPack program, which is an off-the-shelf means of being able to try to treat some of these symptoms. They also ended up doing another group of just standard clinical treatment, which included medication and psychotherapy. And what they found was that the results showed the Super Mario Odyssey group fared the best, with a nearly 50% reduction in depressive symptoms, beating the group that was using standard therapies that were out today by a video game. It's a fun game, too. I quite enjoy it. My good friend Ryan Douglas, he's the founder and chairman at Deepwell DTX. DTX is a digital therapeutic company. And these types of therapies are starting to fall into this new category that we're seeing, digital therapeutics. And Ryan noticed that in this case, there are some systems that we do consciously have control over that we can end up using as a tool when we're not in a situation where we have complex biofeedback loops or instruments at our hands. And it's breath. If you're feeling anxious or there's high levels of anxiety, oftentimes what you can do with the tool in your control of breath, you can slow your breathing down, which will slow down your heart rate. And so there are means through that breath that we can leverage to be able to help us retrain ourselves in ways that can be more subdued. Deepwell ends up producing a game that recently launched called Zengens, which is a means of being able to help you practice this inside of a video game environment, combining the concepts of digital therapeutics and gaming with breath work and teaching people how to be able to engage in these things, in a way that's fun, entertaining, and long-lasting with effects. But what we need to do in these cases is still we need to measure, because oftentimes what happens with therapies like these, or even something so simple as meditation or yoga, as means of treating some of these side effects, they're not measurable from an approach of clinical data. So oftentimes we dismiss them as hokey or shamanistic, when in reality, if we had better tools available to us to be able to measure these things, we might be able to actually create some groundwork for adding validity to these types of therapies. Now, mind you, Adam's company, with that Neuro Racer game, the landmark change that occurred there is that it was the first FDA-approved digital therapeutic. That was back in 2013, 2014. Ryan is moving on to be able to try to be able to enter into this domain and play in this as well with Zengens and other titles. And what we're seeing now is a good recognition by the FDA that they're taking these things seriously. In 2025, reimbursement will be available for digital therapeutics starting, which is huge. And so in order for us to be able to add some more data to this and understand what's really going on and make these things more clinically driven and less hokey, we need to close the loop. And doing this, we can reach for a lot of things that are off the shelf already. We have biosensors, like the Oura Ring, like the Apple Watch. We have technologies like ECG to measure and monitor the heart in a more robust way. And we also have EEG, which is a means of attaching electrodes to the brain in either non-invasive or invasive ways to measure brain activity. EEG is quite interesting and really sparked my interest. There's actually a company that's located in Brooklyn that builds EEG-based technologies that you can start to be able to mess around with today, called OpenBCI. BCI, brain-computer interface. OpenBCI builds open source designs for EEG systems, like the one that's shown here, using a 3D printable helmet headset and offering a variety of different types of sensors and systems or electrodes in packages of dry comb or even the wet electrode mechanisms. And combined with some computing technology, you can start to be able to stream and read your brainwaves. I thought this was so cool, and I needed to have one. And so, armed with all of this knowledge and a box full of parts and 2-week vacation, mind you, I go on vacation, I last for maybe 2 days, and then my brain kicks in and I need to do something. I decided I would build one. And it works. It really does. It's very neat, the kind of data that you start to be able to see from this system. Here, this is my wife taking this picture of me, thinking that I looked crazy or, a little crazy, and comparing me to some Doc Brown Back to the Future. I said, come here, let me read your brain. Don't tell me why you're here. Yeah. And what this led to was my first experiment, which was to be able to do motor control. The EEG electrodes are placed around different areas of the head. In the original picture we saw, that was a 10-20 pattern, which is the standard placement for where EEG electrodes are placed. The frontal cortex here, the frontal lobe, that's a location in which it's going to be responsible for a lot of motor control. And I thought, well, I'm going to run an experiment that allows me to be able to, I'm going to squeeze my hand, my right hand, I'm going to squeeze my left hand, or I'm going to squeeze both my hands. And I want to be able to infer from the data that I receive when I'm running in real time, whether I'm actually squeezing one of those hands or even thinking about squeezing one of those in reaction. And I had quite promising results. We were able to train a model that was relatively accurate. It was over 50%. It was close to 65, 70% on its accuracy, with a fairly small data set that we ended up retrieving from using the EEG headset that was created. But what it ended up teaching me most in that experiment was that the brain is actually kind of boring in a way, and that without additional context, like maybe the environment that you're in, the social cues around you, the physiological conditions of a person, the neurological conditions of a person, all of this extra context mattered and really played a part in the quality of the data that I received. But all of this context is really important even in our lives when it comes to treatments, because the brain is so unique in cases that medicine in these domains often needs to be looked at as quite personalized. And the new types of therapies that we're looking into are ones that are going to sort of coerce your problem into a more stable place. A great example of this comes from the book, The User Illusion. The user illusion, the author here, he uses this term, which is mostly actually founded in computers, that describes the user interface that a person would interact with a computer through. And that if you think about the user interface for a computer, it's a small subset, or it's a highly curated, minimized domain in which you're seeing a small fraction of what's actually going on under the hood of the computer. Network packets are coming in, and we're responding to other things over the network. There's processes running in the background. And he maps this to the concepts of consciousness in a way, and that our consciousness is the user illusion to our world. It is that small subset. And how does this come together with context being so important? Well, in the user illusion, Tor ends up describing something called the tree of talking. And the tree of talking is one where it's quite simple. All of us do this all the time when we communicate to each other. In our minds, we have this interconnected bits of thought that we want to be able to portray the same tree of thought, the same concepts that we see in our head in somebody else who we're talking to in their head. And so what we end up doing is we think about, well, what words would trigger the growth of that tree in my head? And I'm going to use those words and I'm going to say them to you, and then you're going to receive those words and you're going to try to grow that same tree in your head. But it doesn't always work out the same way. Language is actually really low fidelity, and trying to pack all of the things that we're thinking about in our heads into such a low fidelity language and then deliver it to another person who has to unpack it and try to be able to create high fidelity imagery out of it is difficult, especially without context. If I'm telling you a story about a horse and I have a beautiful experience and we go out and there's like wild horses running around and there's a beach and the sunset was phenomenal, and I say those words out loud, but you in your life had a negative experience with a horse, then that already starts to color your thinking and the way that the tree grows in your mind. You're not going to have that same serene feeling that I'm trying to present to you. You're going to have a negative one. And so we have to be in tune with all of this context when it comes to being able to solve some of these problems. Luckily, these days, we can manage complex context more easily. And we do this by means of having enhanced data visualization techniques, things like fMRI and seeing the brain in different ways, signal analysis, data capture and filtering. We can end up really tuning in on what we want to be able to look at. And most importantly, with the age of machine learning and deep learning models, deep learning really is a means of us being able to reorganize complex context data in a way that's fast to search. And I think that it's a wonderful tool for us to be able to use moving forward. And additionally, we have access to a plethora of augmented reality and now robust virtual reality hardware available to us. And I started thinking about my original experiment more. And I thought about all the noise that I had. I thought about the training conditions that I had, just wearing that headset. The kids were running around, the TV was maybe on in the background in the other room. There was audible responses that I had. And I wanted to be able to try to take some of this tool and make a better approach. And simultaneously, we made an interesting discovery. Lauren found that while scrolling through social media, she came across a post that described an optical illusion. It's one of these ones where if you stare at it long enough, that it changes and you can flip it back and forth. It's a horse. And now some people may see this horse walking forward, and some people may see this horse walking backwards. And if you stare at it long enough, you might be able to get your brain to be able to switch from one mode to the other. What she found was, while participating in this, staring at it, trying so hard to be able to get it to flip, that when it did, her pain went away. And I wanted to know more about why that was the case. Something happened. Some sort of experience in that chose different pathways and allowed her to be able to be free from it for a while. And so I thought to myself, well, if we could have greater control over your sensory inputs and your environments, then the experiments that we run, we can have the ability to really tune in to finding the signal amongst all that noise. And so I introduce the next experiment. In this experiment, which I classified as temporal mind, it was a means of trying to discover ways that we can use the time effects of the brain and understand over those time effects where to find the signals. But I did it in full immersion. I took my original design and I remixed it and integrated it into the Apple Vision Pro. By having full control over the experience that you have inside of VR, we can tune out the noise. We can run an experiment that's clean, and we can just present you with the kind of data and capture that we want. And if we have that, we can train a model on that. Then we have a model that was trained on data that it's trying to laser focus on in a non-invasive way. I started with the original headset. I remixed the files and took out just the back portion of it. This is 6-node array that's hitting the occipital lobe mostly, which is where a lot of your vision processing is happening. I leveraged all of the tools and techniques that I've gained and had access to in my lab over time to be able to iterate on this quickly. And what I ended up with was this machine that can read your brain. So one thing that we have to worry with here is the amount of density of people and electronics. We're going to do a small little bit of a demo and just seeing what this activity would look like. OpenBCI, as I mentioned, powers a lot of the electronics in these toolkits. And as such, they offer a means of being able to have a GUI, for example, that can quickly and easily connect to these things and visualize some of this data as well. In a moment, we'll turn this on. I'll try to be able to not mess up my microphone and see if we can see what my brain looks like while giving a talk. All right. Oh, passcode, of course. Let's just do this. Okay, that all made sense to you. Don't copy my passcode. So here I'll start the data stream, and we should start to see some brain activity come in. Now, what we're seeing here is a pretty saturated view because of a lot of the environment that's going on. But we have 6 channels that we're reading, and we're getting some pretty clean time series of this data. And if I relax a bit, we'll see the waves in certain areas start to subdue. When I talk, you'll see them increase. We can even do things like clenching my jaw. You'll see a big increase here, right? So feel free to copy this down. This is what it looks like to give a talk. Now I'm going to remove this for a moment because of reasons that I'll explain. Live demos, even of ones where you're trying to hack your own brain, are risky. So now that we know what we're looking for, we can try to be able to design an experiment around this. So here's what we saw. We saw OpenBCI's panel streaming in the live data. This one that I'm circling right here is effectively a positive deflection that represents a stimulus that we want to capture. So my goal in this case was to be able to try to attenuate and monitor that context. I want to be able to control the environment that you exist in for training, and I want to use that as a means of enhancing the ability to find the signal and the noise. I came across a research paper by actually the Army Research Lab that was working on using EEG signals to perform image classification. And a part of this that they use is what's known as a P300. If we think back to Lebes's research, we can see that the brain itself is actually about 200 milliseconds behind consciousness in the way that you receive data. And in a nutshell, what this means is that while the brain waves are coming in, when a stimulus is presented, a P300 means there's a positive deflection that's 300 milliseconds after the stimulus was presented to the individual. This is the amount of time that it takes for your brain basically to buffer. So I ran an experiment that would that would look for these potentials, and I would render an image into Vision Pro to capture these waves. Here we can see the moment at 0. That's the moment in which the stimulus was presented. The image was rendered inside of Vision Pro. And we can see the positive deflection that's occurring 300 milliseconds afterwards, where that stimulus is actually starting to be able to be recognized and understood. And well, why am I up here not doing this? It's because EEG signals are noisy. They are susceptible to a variety of different things. They're susceptible to movement artifacts. If I were to be moving too much, then a lot of the amplification that's going on here is going to end up showing up in the activity as well. They're also susceptible to some interference, which by means of Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. I imagine there's a lot of that in this room. And in this case, they're noisy because of context, and we're trying to be able to subdue the context in this as well. So, well, what can we do to be able to get better results? The data as part of this experiment is being filtered. First off, I'm filtering out 60 hertz at a notch. That's for US mains. So any ground noise that we're going to get or mains power noise is going to be filtered out. That will show up in the EEG data. And we're doing a bandpass filter between 5 and 50, just to be able to like hone in on where conscious thought is actually occurring. So let's take a look at the architecture. The experiment itself is set up like this. We have the Vision Pro talking to a NVIDIA Jetson processing computer that's doing the execution and the heavy lifting of the machine learning algorithms. That's using Phoenix channels to be able to communicate. So we custom wrote a Swift UI application and embedded the Phoenix channels to connectivity to be able to connect to the Phoenix server with that. The EEG peripheral is using an RF link to be able to communicate also back to the NVIDIA Jetson. And then for model training in the cloud, if we need to be able to do that, we call out to a web backend, we train the model, and then we can push that back down for inference to the Jetson itself. And this is really the amazing part. We've touched and built this with so much access to so much tooling that exists in this ecosystem. We used Phoenix channels. We built a little dashboard with live view. In the case, we can use Flame to be able to distribute these processes out and scale out for model training even further. We've leveraged NX, Explorer, or Text to be able to do inference. We've used Livebook during our experiments and being able to get things moving. As part of the Nerves ecosystem, we even use GPIO and UART. And my company, Peridio, we have a release daemon that lives on the Linux device that we use to be able to do Debian-based releases. This means that when it comes to the NVIDIA Jetson series products, which run by default out of the box a version of Ubuntu, that we don't have to worry in our case of sandboxing or exploring. We can actually deploy our application using Ubuntu-based Debian packaging and do application management and worry a lot about moving into device management layer when we would end up scaling, something like this out. And so how do we synchronize the data? This is pretty interesting. As part of the training routine, what we ended up doing was we have that little loop between the Vision Pro and the Jetson and the EEG peripheral. Well, what we first needed to do is we needed to induce frames into the EEG data stream so that we know the exact moment in which we've presented the stimulus to the user. And to do that, we needed to hook it up a wire basically between that computer and the brain computer, or the headset, the EEG headset. So we used an opto-isolated GPIO circuit, which are pretty cool. It's a relay that is not electrically connected. And one side there's a light, and on the other side there's a photoreceptor that will then, when this side wants to tell the other computer that it wants to turn not GPIO on, that light lights up, the photoreceptor goes, hey, there's light there, and then it turns the relay on. So they're not electrically connected. So we first present the message to Vision Pro to present the stimulus. We say, render this known thing. And in this case, what we were doing was we were using PlayStation style, X, circle, triangle, square. So we tell it, display an X. And then the next thing we do is we set that GPIO on the Jetson to high. And we start to buffer 250 frames because this headset runs at 250 samples per second. We buffer 1 second worth of data of non-stimulus data. That was occurring before, that's why I have it in parentheses. So we have this buffer of like, the screen is in the blank time, and then the moment that we set the Vision Pro to be able to display the graphic, we append this to the back end of it because it helps us smooth the data with the filter chain prior to being able to have the data that we want, right? And then what we do is we wait for the EEG data stream to represent that high pin. Now you can imagine over the RF link, the data stream's coming through. It's not real time. There's going to be some delay. That delay could be, elastic. And so this is why we use a GPIO to be able to trigger that, because on the headset and the EEG computer, we can inject the moment that the GPIO goes high into the data stream of the data frames coming down. That way we wait and we look, and then once that goes high, we go, okay, that's the first frame of when the stimulus was presented. Now take the next 250 frames of data, and that's you seeing it, and then set the GPIO to low and send a message to the Vision Pro to blank. And it was a quite bizarre thing. You imagine this is 2-second intervals of just sitting in full immersion and being shown X, circle, and we'll see a video of this too. So the steps. As we see, the first thing we did was we started acquiring training data. So here's a little representation of what it looks like inside of the headset to be able to enter into the training routine. We connect to the server, we start a training session, we go into full immersion, and we're presented with stimulus. Now at this moment, we're collecting this data. We know what we're showing you, right? So we know that we're showing you this labeled thing, and we then can capture what it looks like for your brain to see it. Taking this data, we ended up working through some filtering chains to be able to ensure that we can get a high quality signal. Without it, we would end up training on some pretty noisy data. And this is key. These days, data visualization of time series, especially when training machine learning models, is very important for you to be able to try to find samples that were inaccurate or noisy that might end up leading your training routine astray. Furthermore, we also end up using for inference the Ortex library. And so, as we can see from this little book here, we ended up pumping in some batches. And so in an inference mode, what I did was I took 2 screenshots of what it's like in Vision Pro. And our results, by training inside of VR, we were able to infer that we were looking at a circle, for example, with 98% accuracy within the noisy environment, and a square, an X at 99%, which is wild. Thanks. We put this together pretty rapidly. And I'm here to be able to say that it's okay to be able to leverage what exists. We use things like Ubuntu on NVIDIA Jetson. We leveraged a lot in the Elixir ecosystem. But early on, we referenced research papers that were training in Python. And that's okay. We wanted to make sure that we had good footing before we ended up porting. And we used friendly tools like Edge Impulse and Peridio to be able to help us with some of the data modeling and understanding what format we wanted the experiment data to be in. And it's important. When you're starting early, reach for things that exist. Use off-the-shelf hardware. In this case, we used what I like to call the sandbox environment, where you don't need to be able to try to find yourself or put yourself into a distribution that's completely locked down and has all the seatbelts on right away. That's hard for you to be able to be in a moment where you're feeling around in the dark and just trying to understand what works. You should use things like Ubuntu that's running on your target if it supports it. And in this case, we can leverage Peridio to be able to help distribute things at an application level to that environment itself. Furthermore, at Peridio, we're also being able to advance some options that you have for being able to create new systems. And currently in development, we're working on a Linux distribution we call Avocado OS. It's a layered approach to being able to build embedded devices. And it's composable. These are the project goals. It's highly composable. It's based off of Yocto ecosystem. And so the idea is that you'll be able to easily and quickly compose together similarly to like you would apt installing things on a mutable system, but in a way that's pre-digested, signed, and secured. And it's also extensible by means that since it's built off of the Yocto system, you can produce your own layers and introduce them into that stack up as well. And we're heavily optimizing for security. Things like encryption at rest and being able to attest your data are concerns that are going to become more and more prevalent as we move forward with doing things like reinforcement learning techniques. The sensor data streams that we receive from edge devices need to have cryptographic signatures applied to them so that when they end up on a server for a training session, that we can verify that that data has not been tampered with. In addition, we have some development goals to be able to make it easier to ship a lot of the mechanisms down. We have in our early development, effectively, you can ship containers, but we believe heavily in that you can write your code in a way that it can produce services and deploy your Elixir applications pretty much the same way that you deploy your Elixir applications to any Linux server. And make it easy for you to be able to reach for other user space libraries and tools that you might need, kernel changes. Or if you want to also, around your Elixir application, maybe ship some Rust or C or C++ or other languages, you can do that as well. In the development loop, we make it so that we simulate an environment like live code reloading, but for all applications. And we're looking to support this in a means of a layer repository. And so people will be able to produce Avocado layers that can be used and pushed into like an apt-based package management system that you can quickly install and get up and running on a variety of different pieces of off-the-shelf hardware. With a Peridio integration to this, it just means that we make it so that when you're done with your application, you want to cut a release, you can just ship those assets to us. But Avocado itself will be completely open source, and you would not need to be able to use Peridio to work with it. Obligatory slide to be able to say we'd love for you to be able to have a conversation with us, and we're offering some incentives for some free developer access in order to hear more from you, how you'd like to use the tools and grow your experience. So now that we have this interesting technology, what are the future potentials for it? Well, one thing that I see is, in the case of closing the loop, with VR, we can immerse you into an experience that we can generatively create light therapies on the fly and environments that might bring you some peace, or it might bring you like intrigue or joy. But most importantly, with generative techniques, while monitoring the signal that we found that we want to attenuate, we can have the ability to introduce stimulus and see how you receive it on the fly. And with those techniques, it affords us the abilities to create a new generation of therapies that can be more personalized to the problems that you have. And so I would argue in this case that where we're about to enter is the era of deep context computation. And to frame this a bit, I would like to point at where we've come from. In the 40s and up to the 70s, we had batch processing as a means of computation. Right? Put your punch cards in, get your response out. Hopefully you didn't trip on the way to the machine and reorder your stuff, because otherwise you're going to have an error and you have to redo the entire sequence. Command and response systems were effectively what we've had for a very long time. That's where now you can interrupt, or you can even just do short bits of programming back and forth. There's a holding state. And I would argue that what we're moving into is this era of deep context, where we're going to start to be able to include environment, or like sociological changes, or physiological changes, or neurological conditions that are going to be able to be present and held within these complex machine learning models to help us have a more personalized approach to computation, to our interactions, and the way that we operate. I say these things because I really think that, to point out, we've had these technology hype bubbles, right? Everybody jumped on and thought IoT was going to be the big thing, and it wasn't. Then everybody thought that blockchain was going to be the big thing, and it wasn't. And then now everybody thinks that AI is going to be the big thing, and TBD, right? But the reality I see in these cases is that these bubbles occurred because they thought that these were the products. But I think that these are the tools. And together, they're going to help us create a new series of products. That's the next super cycle. Those who leverage the modernized product development toolchain are going to be the ones who are going to create products of this new type. And to illustrate this, I find a pretty whimsical and simple example. I think that out of this, we're going to find a new realm of sensors or components, even from a hardware perspective, that we can leverage to be able to do these things. While here in Orlando, I spent some time at Universal and ended up engaging with the Harry Potter magical universe, the wands. And these were really cool and interesting. And the part about it that was interesting after figuring it out was, effectively, if you're not familiar, you perform a magic spell, and then it's by means of it drawing the shape that's there, and then the thing you're trying to interact with will light up or perform some movement, right? And the wand itself is passive. It's really dumb. The only thing special about the wand, it has this little gem at the tip of it. And I looked into it. I found the patents, and I figured out how they ended up making it work. My kids were upset over the fact that they were told that it would only work in the magical land that was at Universal. Well, it turns out what they're doing is quite clever. They have an infrared array around a camera, and the tip of the wand has a gem that will reflect infrared light. And when you point it in the direction of the thing you're trying to influence, the camera will see the dot, and it'll use a bit of persistence of vision to be able to generate the shape as you imagine drawing in the air with a sparkler. And it'll do computer vision techniques over that shape to determine whether or not it's the shape of it's close enough to the shape of the key that should trigger that trick. And I thought that this was amazing because it's now one of the first times that I've seen that camera technologies and infrared and machine learning has become commoditized to the point where it's being used for these types of experiences. You'd think that in these cases, people would reach for the lowest amount of tech that could be possible to be able to make it work. But we're finally starting to be able to see sensors that are not cost prohibitive, being able to be used in these types of entertainment domains. And so I'd like to leave you with a few things today. I think it's really important that you focus on leveraging what exists and invest in dependency deliberately. There's so many times I've seen people go astray when they try to solve the cases. They have their eye on solving this one problem, but instead they get derailed because they feel like some dependency that they need to be able to achieve that is not quite good enough. And so they go off on a tangent and start rebuilding that dependency only to find that now they are the maintainers of that dependency, and that's become the thing that they focused on. In addition, we have a whole swath of tools in this ecosystem that are performant and growing, and they are ready to be used to be able to solve and apply towards all of these problems in this new tool chain that we can use to create these new solutions. We're also solving multimodal problems, and they require multimodal solutions. Just because, and I know all of us do, love Elixir, the thing that you're trying to accomplish doesn't need to be 100% written in Elixir. It's okay if some dependency that would get you to that next step to prove the concept that you're trying to build is in another language. There's interoperability that you can leverage to be able to get it working and then decide if you need to be able to embrace it more. And it's important that all of us really focus on solving the problems that bring us fulfillment. Find a reason and a purpose to be able to apply yourself to these things. And of those reasons, they might be for joy, or they might be for necessity. They might even be for curiosity, or they could be for care and love. Thank you.